Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, the ECHR, against France regarding three specific asylum seekers. Now, these three men, one Afghan, one Russian, and an Iranian as well, were sleeping rough on the streets of Paris for a number of months without access to sanitary facilities and other just basic facilities as well, such as subsistence and otherwise, and they were in fear of their lives to an extent where they were in fear of being attacked or robbed. Now, they had been issued temporary allowance to remain, that's for two of these men at least, for several months, but they hadn't been told of that immediately and were still then on the streets for a number of days at the very least, even after that temporary allowance was issued to the two of them again. Now, the court also does, though, to be fair to France, say that since the year 2007, there has, of course, been an exponential rise in the number of migrants and asylum seekers showing up, even in France, seeking asylum there or elsewhere in Europe. So it did appreciate the fact that France has set up accommodation and otherwise. Nevertheless, it said that that does not take away from the fact that France does have, of course, obligations within Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and has then given these three men between 10 to 12,000 euros each as compensation at this time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. And I'm joined by Liza Schuster, who is a migration expert. She's worked on European asylum policies for 30 years, especially in the UK, France, Germany. She's also hosted, in fact, for a short period of time, some of those who have been forced to sleep on the streets of the French capital. She spent previously 6 years in Afghanistan studying deportation and migrants. She's joining us from the French capital, Paris, today. Also joining us from Paris is Gregory Viscusi, who is an American journalist based in Paris. And finally, we're also joined from London by Giorgia, who is a professor of forced migration, and she's also the co-director of the Centre for Migration, Refugees and Belonging at the University of East London, and she is joining us from London. Giorgia, Gregory, and Liza, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Gregory, let me start with you. What do you make of this ruling? I know it is just three men, but in the larger scheme of things, is this indicative possibly of how a lot of these asylum seekers are living in Paris?
Yeah, I'm surprised it's only three. I mean, at various times, at any time of the year, you can go to all sorts of places on the bridges just underneath the highway that rings Paris, and there's tent cities with, hundreds, if not thousands of people. The police will clear out one, and they'll just show up somewhere else. Now, not all of them are asylum seekers. Some of them are what we would term as economic migrants, but they're people who've come to France seeking to stay in France, and it's hundreds at a time. Now, as you mentioned, the problem is just numbers. That there were probably about 120,000 asylum seekers in France last year. That's up 3 or 4 times in a decade. It's rising at about 10% a year. And although the French government pledges to put them up in housing, they are just overwhelmed. I mean, they've got apparently space for 100,000 people to house, but they've got demands for about 140,000. So, as I said, I'm surprised it's only 3 people in this case.
Liza, what are your thoughts about the case? It seems that France is now under the spotlight, but that certainly doesn't excuse the rest of Europe, does it?
Absolutely, it doesn't excuse the rest of Europe, but it also doesn't excuse France. Gregory mentioned that there were only 3. In fact, the case was taken for 5 people. 1 disappeared, 1 was rejected, and the judge found in favor of 3 people. But the point is that lawyers will seek to find a small number of people with whom they are sure that they can win a case, on the assumption that once this case is won for those 3 people, it then applies to everyone else. Having said that, the difficulty is that decisions have been made against France in the past, and subsequently the asylum seekers have not received the funding that was due to them, the fines that they should pay. So that's one problem. As Gregory says, there are large numbers of people around Paris, in the north of France, in the south of France, on the border between Italy and France, living effectively destitute lives. That's a very serious problem. But France is not overwhelmed. It's an extremely wealthy European country. It's a political choice not to house these people, to leave them in this kind of limbo for a period of time. And France does that for 2 reasons. One, it's trying to dissuade others from coming. You will hear French politicians and French journalists talking about the danger, the risk of an appel d'air. They're worried that if word gets out that France is generous, then more people will come. And the other reason is, to a large extent, France saw itself for a period of time as a transit country. So it was, why would we invest money in housing people, sending young people into school, if ultimately they're going to leave and go to Sweden or Norway or the UK? And so it's a way of encouraging people to move on and discouraging people from coming in the first place.
Okay, so Giorgia, what are your thoughts on that? Do you believe that this is very much a political decision instead of necessarily a logistical one, where there simply aren't the facilities really available to be able to deal with the situation?
I agree with the previous speakers, and I do think that it is a political decision whose effects we see now, but it is the outcome of a long process that has been going on for years, and in the UK for decades, of undermining the rights of those who come to this country. And in the last few months, I think the example of destitution is visible across Europe. In the UK, we have a high number of migrants who are with no recourse to public funds, and they are at risk of destitution. We see an increase in food banks for those who are really struggling, and again, unemployment. So with regard to accommodation, I think that this case, in a way, highlights something which is quite important, and it is in a way the right to have to be able to live and survive and to have a good quality of life. And in a way, while in the UK, to point out that the situation is at the moment with the pandemic slightly better, in the sense that those who are in the asylum system at least can live in temporary accommodation. That, in a way, doesn't address some of their rights or the ways in which the responses to the pandemic have enabled them to survive. So we've seen a high number of migrants and members of ethnic minorities dying. So there is a disproportionate number of people who are not able to survive for some of the reasons that have been mentioned. And I think that also needs to be, in a way, taken into the broad picture. And if I want to make the last point, accommodation and survival is one of the issues, but we also need to remember that one of the, the gaps or the amnesias or the omissions that we are thinking about is that this pandemic and the current global situation of austerity will mean that the rights of migrants will need to be thought about at political level.
Okay, so let's discuss that at a political level then, Gregory, because we know that Germany is taking over the EU rotating presidency, and Germany has very much come in as the country that wants to once again put on the table the issue of sharing out asylum seekers / refugees who show up on Europe's shores evenly or as equally as possible throughout Europe. We know that that has been something that has been a point of great division amongst European countries. Do you think that the likes of France and Germany, as those countries that have been pushing for that sort of sharing out of these people, will this work this time around?
Well, well, let's get to that. But I just want to refer to what we were talking earlier about it being a political decision.
Sure.
Of course, it's a political decision. But I would make another political point, which is that if there's one thing that populist leaders in all countries have in common is they've managed to convince their voters that their governments are spending money on foreigners that they're not spending on nationals. And I remember talking to a French minister back in 2015 when France last updated its asylum policies. And he was saying, look, if we asked our voters how many refugees should we take, the answer would be 0. And so it's a very sensitive subject here. Of course, governments don't spend anywhere near as much on asylum seekers as they send on their own citizens. But that idea has gone out amongst populist circles. And so that's something that all governments are very, very keen to work about. Now, on the European level, yes, there's a total unfair balance of sharing asylum seekers. If you look at who receives the most requests, it's Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Greece. They account for something like 80% of all asylum requests within Europe. There are countries in Eastern Europe that refuse to take any of them. But it's very hard to force them to do that. And I really don't see why this attempt would be any more successful. I mean, back in 2015, when we had back a few years ago, when we had that big rush of migrants, as asylum seekers coming from Syria, there was a sense, at least then there was some sort of sense of emergency that something had to be done and countries had to share the burden. Right now, I just don't think you're going to get Poland and Hungary and countries like that to agree to take their fair share. I don't see how the Germans are going to manage this time. Maybe others disagree, but...
Liza, what are your thoughts on that? Because certainly it seems actually, even in a situation where you also now have the coronavirus pandemic, also on top of the fact that you have disagreements about migrants/asylum seekers anyhow, long-standing agreements within Europe, does Germany have any chance of succeeding this time around in trying to convince countries like Poland or others to take in asylum seekers or migrants?
To be frank, I don't think so at all. I think that if we look back to 2015, 2016, when those people were coming in from Syria, you had a degree of political leadership from Angela Merkel. Unfortunately, none of the other European leaders showed any balls, and they failed to follow her lead, which was a real missed opportunity to shift the European debate around asylum and around our moral obligations to that population. However, I want to take up something that Gregory said earlier. It's really important to understand that, yes, in many countries in Europe, there is a populist leadership and they appeal to the worst of human nature. But it's also important to remember that many of these asylum seekers in Europe survive because there is also an informal network of Europeans from all countries that accommodate them, take them into their homes, try to provide them with food. Because the conditions in which people are living along the motorways without any sanitary facilities whatsoever are completely degrading, and people's lives are at risk. And it's not just the single men about whom this judgment was made. There are families with small children, pregnant women, unaccompanied minors sleeping on the streets of Paris and Budapest and Athens and Rome and London. Less London, I'll be frank. But there is a real problem in persuading governments to actually listen to the voices of those other Europeans that are largely silent and get on with trying to help people. And this is a real issue. Hopefully, things might be starting to turn even in the east of Europe. But it's a difficult decision. We need political leadership. We need people who are willing to stand up and to defend those so-called European values of humanitarianism, of a respect for human rights, which is what is at issue in this particular judgment. Because the decision came about not because people were left to sleep on the streets for a few nights. They were left to sleep on the streets in one occasion for 180 nights with nothing, no access to a toilet, no access to a shower, not knowing what they were going to eat, not knowing when the police were going to come, destroy their tent, tear up their papers, and potentially deport them back to persecution.
You know, Giorgia, you know, as Liza there mentioned, you certainly from the outside in, when you just hear these stories, you know, it reminds you that these are human beings who are going through this, right? Regardless of the fact that they may be stateless, maybe, you know, escaping persecution of any sort, et cetera. Do you also believe, Giorgia, that at some level, these grassroots movements of people in European countries who are coming out and helping these asylum seekers / migrants and refugees, that will be the impetus for some positive changes within policies of governments?
Yes, I actually share with Liza a bit of optimism, because at the political level, even though an EU response would have been really a way forward years ago, we see recently even in the UK that the Dobbs Amendment, which allowed unaccompanied children who were in France to be joined with their families in Europe, has been rejected in the House of Commons only like a month ago, a few weeks ago. So I don't have much hope, but I have hope around society. I mean, the community response in the last few months has been incredible. So all the food banks that are providing for destitute asylum seekers, all the people who are taking them in their homes, and they're providing help in so many ways, sometimes even a phone call, has been incredible. And I think that, in a way, if I look at this global movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, to me is an indication that the young generation do want a different world, which is much more like fair and respectful of the humanity of everybody. So I also agree that it is really at societal level that we are going to make a change and then push for a political change. I don't see it happening at political level at this moment, but I see it happening in the future if we keep pressing.
Gregory, do you share that optimism? Do you think that the younger generation, as well as those who are currently doing their part in helping these asylum seekers and migrants, do you think that that sort of pressure will, A, grow, and B, become enough for governments to eventually down the road act?
It'll grow. I'm not sure it's enough. And I would be the first to pay tribute to these groups and to be fair also to the Catholic Church that has worked a lot with migrants. There's extraordinary groups across Europe, and that's the only reason these people are being fed. It's the only reason they've got any hope of having, some kind of a tent to sleep under, a shower, anything. So there certainly is a remarkable grassroots measure. The problem is that the governments in Europe are terrified of the Marine Le Pens in France, the Salvinis in Italy, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. And it's those sort of groups that have managed to convince a huge number of voters of the lie that somehow asylum seekers are living the high life while nothing is being paid to citizens of those countries. And I say it's a complete lie, but it's something they've managed to convince a lot of their voters, and that's a much bigger fear of governments in Europe than it is having the wrath of these sort of grassroots organizations that take care of the migrants. So I just think that the balance of power politically is not in their favor, sadly.
Liza, I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. One thing that we haven't touched upon yet is, of course, foreign policy, right? Because we can talk about certainly how Europe deals with these people once they've arrived on its shores. But then there's also that huge issue of the root causes of why these people would leave their respective countries. And some of that, if we're completely honest with us, does have to do with, arguably, some people would argue, I should say, Europe's involvement in some places, possibly even in the Middle East, through arms sales, etc. Do you think Europe is willing to sort of self-reflect on its foreign policies that might be, sort of resulting in these people showing up on its shores to begin with?
I do think we need a change at the top of European political elites. If we look at European policies, much of it has been to close Europe to people coming in from the outside and to pay buffer states such as Turkey, such as Libya, in order to take people back. And you also see increasingly pressure on countries of origin, such as Afghanistan, to try and prevent people leaving in the first place. Yeah. So I'm afraid, sadly, I agree with Gregory to a certain extent. I think European governments at the moment are incredibly self-interested and incredibly cynical. And that's totally unjust.
Very well. We'll leave it there. Of course, as always, we appreciate all three of our guests for their time and their insight on this important topic. That was Liza and Gregory, both speaking to us from the French capital, and Giorgia, who was speaking to us from London. Now, we got through a lot there, of course. Of course, the issue of these three asylum seekers is more indicative, really, isn't it, of how many of these asylum seekers, even economic migrants, some of them, as Gregory said, who are sleeping rough on the streets of Paris, London, and other major cities across Europe, mainly in these countries such as the UK, France, Germany, etc., and Spain included. But how are these governments dealing with them? The more political issue, of course, here is, as Gregory said, is that populist leaders, especially those in Eastern Europe and other places, have been able to convince their populations that they're ending up spending more on migrants and asylum seekers than they are spending on their own citizens, therefore taking away resources from citizens who feel that they deserve it more than somebody coming from the outside, and even if fleeing persecution or otherwise. But that is, of course, incorrect, and is a facade that has been created by these governments to then ride on that political wave and ensure that they do not then take in their fair share of migrants. Will Germany, with this rotating presidency, be able to change that reality on the ground in Europe? Doubtful, but maybe down the road, by these grassroots movements of people who are actually doing the right thing and ensuring that these people are fed and have facilities to use as restrooms otherwise, maybe that pressure will grow in the coming years and will be enough to eventually mean a change for the positive by government policies across Europe. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Venezuela and a UK High Court decision to block Venezuela's request for access to its gold that is kept in the Bank of England or by the Bank of England. Now, this, of course, is the Maduro government that I'm talking about specifically that requested that gold. There is no, of course, secret that the Maduro government and Venezuela as a whole is going through a dismal, economic crisis, and which has only gotten much, much worse because of the coronavirus pandemic. Venezuela had said, or the Maduro government had said, that it wanted access to this gold. It would hand that over to the United Nations to ensure that it would only be spent for what it needed to be spent for, i.e. to help the country in this time to be able to deal with the pandemic. Nevertheless, of course, the UK, as we know, as in many other countries around the world, have declared Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. So where does that then leave this gold? Where does that then leave the need to help Venezuela at this time to deal with this pandemic? And where does this leave Venezuela's gold, its own property, really, that is kept in the UK? Who has legitimate access to that at this point in time? Who should have access to that at this point in time? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Guy Burton, who is an adjunct professor of international affairs at Viscusi College in Brussels. He's joining us now from Brussels. Joining us from Stirling in the UK is Pedro Ariel Sanchez, who is a doctorate researcher at Political Sciences Institute for European Studies at Giorgia University, Brussels. His native country is Argentina, but as I said, he is joining us from Stirling in the UK today. Pedro and Guy, thank you both for your time today. Pedro, let me start with you. What do you make of the UK court ruling? Maduro will not get access to this gold. What does that then mean for Venezuela?
For Venezuela, that is a massive crash. The country is already facing a very difficult situation. So if you continue putting these kind of measures in the country, of course, the situation is immediate. It is devastating.
Indeed. So then, what are your thoughts on the UK deciding at this point in time who is really leading Venezuela? I mean, there is that whole Guaido versus Maduro dynamic right now.
It's completely illegal. I mean, the only president in Venezuela is Maduro. Guaido actually had some very difficult argument, but last January he lost the only power that he had in the National Assembly. And so that is a kind of a legislative power in Venezuela. And so the forced argument that they did initially plays no role. So from a legal perspective, at least the majority of the Latin American countries, we all think that is ridiculous.
Yeah. So then, Guy, what are your thoughts on this? Because it seems confusing, right? That you have all these Western countries who have declared Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela, yet the UK has all of this Venezuelan gold. For them, obviously, it makes sense to hand this, I imagine, over to the likes of Guaido. But then, does Guaido even have the means to be able to deal with having that gold used for the proper, to fulfill the legitimate needs of the Venezuelan people?
Yes, I mean, thank you for having me on the show again. And I mean, this is one of the big problems that Guaido has faced since he became the apparent interim president at the beginning of last year. When that happened in January of 2019, there was this flurry of diplomatic reaction, of recognition. So we have around 60 countries that recognize him, primarily European in the Northern Hemisphere. But the problem, of course, is that they've pretty much sort of overestimated their ability to be able to, force Maduro to one side. Over the course of the last year, Guaido has tried to win over the military, to try and sort of encourage more sort of humanitarian assistance and to basically try and sort of translate his diplomatic recognition into something more meaningful and substantial. That hasn't happened. And certainly by the beginning of this year, there was a sense of disillusionment amongst many in Venezuela. Public opinion was showing that, whereas there had been sort of, some interest in Guaido, or at least someone as an alternative to Maduro, there was a sense that Guaido is not really the man for them.
So then, and how do you feel then about a country like the UK essentially just, I wouldn't say the word is interfering, but deciding who is the leader and then deciding who should get Venezuelan property, really, such as gold?
So obviously the legal judgment was based on a very sort of legalistic interpretation in which they said that, because the UK had recognized Guaido, they were going to deal with him rather than with Maduro. And this is one of the big problems that Venezuela faces today, that, politically, authority seems to be split between these two individuals. Certainly, I mean, from Guaido's perspective, this is a very good news because it sort of counters sort of a run of experiences and events over the last 18 months, which have sort of worked against him. So certainly, you know, Guaido and parts of the opposition will seize upon that. But let's not forget that Guaido himself, you know, does not represent a unified opposition. Within the opposition itself, there's a lot of different strands, different takes on how to deal with Maduro. Some wanting to take, you know, to be involved in the elections that are scheduled at the end of this year. Others, like Guaido, who are talking about boycotting them.
All right, so Pedro, tell us what kind of an effect this has, because then, as Guy there said, this has made Guaido seemingly stronger because now he has this access to this gold, right? Do you think that he will take this time upon himself to use that gold for his own purposes?
That's a very good question. It's difficult to side with that. I do not agree with any kind of recognition of Guaido, particularly when we are looking at, in fact, it's 50, not 60 countries, if I'm correct. The majority of the recognition abroad is due to USA foreign policy. And we all know that. I mean, to disregard that would be awkward. But then the rest of the narrative about if he's going to do something with the gold or not, so far he has been lobbying only to put more pressure on Venezuela. At the end of the day, just people are paying for that. And in that regard, there is not much public debate about it, not in the European official media, not let alone the British, no? So if you ask me if Guaido is going to do anything, and so far he didn't do anything. It's not like there is a division there. He has no recognition. There is no such a thing as a division because he didn't win anything in January. He was out of any political relevance. So there is not correlation with that argument. But then in relation to if he's going to do something, there was an agreement with Maduro recently that it seemed to be okay, but then things ended up as they are now. No? So no, definitely I would be very surprised if he's going to do something. The only one thing that he did so far it was to align with the USA to do an invasion, for example, to invasion of the country where failed. Particularly the UK was involved with that.
But then Pedro, to be fair, if I may come in, Guaido must have supporters, significant numbers of supporters within Venezuela, right, to be able to pull off what he did pull off. So, I mean, there is a significant portion of Venezuela's population that does support him. How does one deal with those people as well?
Let's face it that diversity in politics is very healthy. We believe in that, yeah? There is no diversity there in the way that is forced. So we believe in diversity when it's voted and there is a consent, but no in this way. And so I would not be able to think that there is something good about it. I would hope that they would find a way. But so far, foreign powers were not they didn't do anything further than putting sanctions. And that is shambolic. It goes against very basic human rights values. They don't exist. And if that is going to play any good thing, it's quite embarrassing because even the case that they were true that Guaido was the president, it's embarrassing that the country has to beg to get back their own sources. That is a violation of sovereignty. It's a very, very, very serious issue.
Indeed, and you know, Guy, I wonder Venezuelans are meant to make of the fact that A, the UK has blocked their government's access to this gold, and B, that other governments are even trying to block the likes of, you know, the Iranian government, for example, sending fuel over, because as we know, of course, right now in the current situation, Venezuela is simply not able to refine enough of its own oil to be able to supply its own fuel needs. You know, it just seems that this kind of pressure, it probably isn't creating or winning any hearts and minds within Venezuela, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is that if we look at the sort of Venezuelan society, I mean, as I pointed out, that there was some enthusiasm and support for Guaido at the beginning of last year, but Venezuelan society has sort of shifted away from that. There's a general feeling that there's a majority that are not happy with Maduro, but you've still got a significant minority, around a third of the population, that still supports him. The opposition is in an awkward situation because they've tried a number of different things to try and sort of get over this hurdle. They've stood for they've been involved in the electoral process. They've encouraged people to come out onto the streets. They've also engaged in a national dialogue with Guaido. I mean, under sort of the sponsorship of international mediators. But with Maduro under international mediators. But there has not been any kind of resolution. And part of this is because there is a very, very big split, a really strong polarization in Venezuelan society between the government, the Maduro government on one side, and the opposition on the other. Also, you have compounded with this, as you pointed out, an economic situation which is just getting worse and worse. Venezuela used to be a major oil producer, but its production has collapsed in recent years, and it's not simply because of the decline in oil prices. It's also because of a failure to invest efficiently and effectively, which has only sort of compounded further the inability to produce more. So I think, to come back to the point that you asked about sort of where do Venezuelans go from here, I think some of the stories that are coming out seem to suggest that people are moving away from politics and just trying to focus on dealing with day-to-day realities. That's why you've had such a significant number of people seeking to leave Venezuela, and also those that have come back just trying to find eke out a living.
Indeed. So, Pedro, situation certainly cannot continue indefinitely, right? Because the Venezuelan economy continues to take more and more hits. I mean, just the sanctions itself, and then, the fact that its refineries, they weren't able to refine oil to enough of an extent to be able to supply the country. And then we've had this pandemic as well. Then we've had all those Venezuelans leaving the country. Some of them have now come back because of the pandemic. I mean, there seems to be this situation where we're at a stalemate, but at the same time, it's very hard to imagine a permanent situation where the likes of Iran, for example, can supply fuel to Venezuela forever. I mean, this can't work forever, right? What is the solution then?
The solution is far away from now. I think the help from the Iranian government has been outstanding from the humanitarian perspective. It will not be able to carry on in this way. And the reason is because of the investment and the support that Guaido has. And if you are looking at the narrative presented, particularly in Western countries, the belief that Guaido has some kind of support. But if you could perhaps be in contact with human rights activists at the local level, and if you would bother to talk to the locals, you would realize quite quickly that it is true that it's very difficult, but it is also true that there is no such support of Guaido. And then the situation was very defined last January. It has been defined. We can agree that there are some tensions in the voting system, but the situation has been very well established. It's not accepted, but it's a common hegemonic thing. It's a very patronizing posture, and it's quite complicated to keep going. Trying to grasp some theories there or some statistics, who knows from where. But in reality, if you talk to locals, then you realize that the situation is absolutely different, and it's not certainly the case that there is a reduced elite on the left. And the country is well-established socialist. The only one thing that is not comfortable for the USA and the particular hegemonic powers. But the narrative about Guaido is completely irreal. It does not exist. If you talk to locals, if you contact local human rights activists, then you will realize that it's absolutely a joke. The only one thing that there is no space for local activists or local journalists to actually have a view. So the only one access that we have is alternative media. It's alternative media and spaces where people can actually share the reality. But the situation is not as bad as portrayed about it, and it's always the case that it's Maduro, the bad figure. But nobody talks about the role of the European Union and the USA with the ongoing 17 years with sanctions. So ignoring that is just ridiculous.
Yes, on that, I'll give you the final word, because on that factor of the sanctions, right, even by the EU, the US, and others on Venezuela at this point in time, I wonder how long that situation can continue as well, because as both of you have agreed, Guaido hasn't really achieved what he was meant to have achieved by now, even with all of this overwhelming support, if we're completely honest, the backing of the entire Western world, really. Considering that hasn't happened, do you think that all of the above are probably reevaluating their positions?
Well, certainly the Americans have sort of taken a bit of a step back. I mean, it's not that they've completely abandoned Guaido, but they've not been sort of as enthusiastic in their support as they were last year. But yes, I mean, when we look at the sort of the sanctions that have been taking place, I mean, this is part of their sort of part of a two-strand strategy, which is sanctions and diplomatic pressure to try and either in an ideal world for the Western countries to see Maduro forced from power, alternatively get him to actually compromise and work with the opposition. The problem, as I've said, is that you have a very deeply divided polity in Venezuela with very different narratives about what's going on there. And so, when you ask the question, so what happens going forward here? I mean, what's going to require is some kind of reconciliation and some recognition on both sides that they cannot get, that neither side can get completely what they want. But that's going to be very difficult to achieve given the low levels of trust that exist now.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but I appreciate both Guy and Pedro for their time today and, of course, their insight on this issue. The issue of Venezuela is complex to an extent, but simple also, where you have two men both claiming to be the legitimate leader of the country. Maduro claims, as he's been voted in, legitimately. Guaido has been claimed to be the leader by some Venezuelans, as well as much of the Western world supports him, has placed sanctions on the Maduro government, has now blocked access of the Maduro government to Venezuela's gold that is kept in the Bank of England. He badly needs that gold to be able to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic in his country, as well as, of course, if we're honest, the economic crisis that country is facing as well. For how long can allies such as Iran supply fuel to Venezuela at this time? I mean, Iran is under extreme pressure by the U.S. Those tankers continue to be sanctioned by the United States as well. So can that situation continue forever? What is plan B or C or D? As Guy there said, so reconciliation really is the only way, but who will take that first step forward? Who will bring out that olive branch to really resolve the situation? Because again, Venezuelans in the middle of all this, as Pedro had mentioned, are the ones who are really suffering at the end of all these sanctions that have been placed on the country. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.